North America has its own interesting story. So what happened was, across the Bering Strait, you had the region of Russia. So people started to move from Russia by land, crossing the Bering Strait, coming into the American mainland. And this is something around 30,000 years back. Around 10,000 years ago, when you had the period of last ice age that was seen, these people started to move further southwards. Later on, around 5,000 years ago, the climate started to stabilize, and slowly and gradually these people started to move across the territory. The oldest artifacts that have been seen are arrow points. So they are arrow points, and these arrow points are around 11,000 years old. So again, very interesting how these civilizations have developed in the region of North America. The civilizations of North America have a very different history than other countries across the globe. The civilizations, the native people used to live in groups, and these groups were known as bands. Now these bands were located mainly along the river valleys, so be it the Mississippi, Missouri, be it the Mackenzie, be it any other river, you had the civilizations that were the tribals, the native people who were residing close to the river valleys. Towards the, if we talk about a broad geographical aspect to understand this concept further, towards the west you had the Rocky Mountain ranges, then you had the Appalachians towards the east, and there was significant development that was seen within the mainland, which was mainly a land of hunting during that time. Now during this time you had a very interesting story that was seen, and the land was occupied by bisons. Now these bisons were hunted only to an amount they were required. So this is a very important concept that we are talking about. The natives used to consider the land, the wild animals, as sacred. They used to hunt it only for the amount that was required for themselves, not more than that, not beyond that. When people from Spain started to enter Americas, you had horses that were introduced. So initially bisons were hunted by the local dwellers on foot, but later on when horses came, these tribes started to hunt the bisons on horses. So that was a kind of gradual change that was witnessed in Americas. Now what were the characteristics of these bands that were there? There were few very interesting characteristics. Firstly, there was no surplus agriculture. They used to grow to an amount that is required for themselves, for their tribe to be happy. There was no concept of kingdom, no concept of empire that existed. There was no feeling of owning of the land, and that is one of the primary concepts that we need to understand here. They did not own the land. They did not say that this is our parcel of land, this is our parcel of land. For them, land was sacred. They used to worship it, and they used to consider it as a source for their livelihood. That was the only aspect. Another important story about the natives of Americas were that they had a good alliance, they lived in friendship, and they believed strongly in exchanging gift. So any person who comes, let's say, from Spain, they used to exchange gift, and that was one of the major part of their traditions. Most of the language that was moving from one generation to another was oral. Very less written, documented literature has been seen. So most of the tribes from Americas had their conversations that went on from generations to generation through oral languages. And another important aspect was these people were highly skilled craftsmen. They were exemplar craft people, and there was a very strong belief in their society, and this belief was that everything occurs in cycles. one thing that goes up has to come down. That is something that these tribes strongly believed in. And therefore, they said that history is written and rewritten from one generation to another. So it's through the oral messages that what has happened over the generations is being passed to the next generations. And they could read the land, they could understand the climate, and based on that, they could understand what kind of agriculture would go well. So they were being illiterate, but they were highly literate in the sense what to grow, when to grow, what kind of agriculture crops would come up. So that was some of the characteristics of the bands and the tribes. I repeat again, one of the most important characteristics that we would understand further along is that they did not had a feeling of owning the land. They did not focus on rights of land. So that was very, very important. Now, these native people, as we said, were very, very friendly and very, very welcoming. They were called by different names across different parts of the globe. So Native Americans were the indigenous people of America, and that's the most common term that is used even today. Red Indians was a term used by Columbus when he mistook America for India, and the people who discovered were reddish brown in complexion, and therefore known as Red Indians. Indigenous people are the native people who belong to their own land. Similarly, in Canada, the first group of organized native people were there, and these were known as bands by the Indian Act 1876, and after the Indian Act, these were known as the nations, and therefore the First Nation people was the name that was given by Canada. The next is the American Indians or the Emirates or the Amerindians, and that were the people of North and South America along with the Caribbean region. Also, Aboriginals, as the name was for the people from Australia, the native dwellers of Australia. Now, this is a Latin word. Ab means from and original means the beginning. So, from the beginning, the people who resided there were the Aboriginals, as simple as that. So those were the kind of common texts that was seen and common ideas that were percolating. Now, interestingly, there are the names of the tribes that we are familiar with from America. Let's say the Dakota tribe, the Cherokee tribe, the Pontiac tribe, and Mohawk tribe. Their meanings are somewhat interesting, but not at all related to what the tribes were. So, for example, Dakota is a tribe, and the word Dakota means aeroplane, Cherokee means a jeep, Pontiac means a car, and Mohawk means a haircut. None of the tribes had any resemblance or anything to do with the meaning or names that were suggested. Similarly, there is a one very interesting story, and this is by the Hopi tribes. Now, Hopi was one of the interesting tribes of California, and these people believed that some human beings would come in as turtles. So what happened was, they were people from Spain who entered their land, and they were all dressed in armors and well armored people who came into their land, and they said, oh, they are turtles entering into our land, and they are our brothers and sisters. So with the hope that they would mingle with us, they brought about their hand for a hope of a handshake, and since they extended their hand for a hope, they were called as Hopis. So that's the name of the tribe, Hopis. But rather than a handshake, what they got was a kind of trinket, and that means that the history reveals that there was a harsh time that has to begin with for Americas, and the people, the settlers who are moving in are very, very harsh, and they would suffer the natives to the worst of the situations that could be ever witnessed. Now, how it all started? We would understand the north and the south. So in the north, you had mainly the fish and the fur that was common, and in the south, mainly the region of California, it was gold that was seen. So these were the two things for which Europeans were very, very greedy. As we said in the beginning, The people, the natives, were hunting bisons to satisfy their own need for meat. However, when Europeans advented into, they exterminated the bisons. They killed it so badly. There was severe slaughters of beavers, of bisons that took place, and all of those were meant for meat in Europe, and they were traded to Europe. But from the perspective of the native Americans that were there, this was a brutal act. They believed that Europeans were highly greedy, and they were there to acquire the resources which they could have never imagined. The natives there could have never imagined that they would take up all the resources, the fishes, the fur, and take it to European land. On some of the years, they would give them very good gifts. On some other times, they would not give them something. So there was a huge variation in the gifts or the amount that was being given to the local tribes, and these people were unable to understand what was happening around. Again, as we said, the natives were using a lot of tobaccos. So when Europeans came in, they gave Europeans the habit of using tobacco. On the other hand, Europeans, when entered into Americas, they brought with them guns, they brought with them alcohol, they brought with them iron vessels, blankets, and iron vessels and blankets were given as gifts. So the natives believe that they are very friendly to us. They are giving us gifts in turn for the fur and the fish they are taking from our region, or the gold they are taking from our region. But in reality, along with the blankets, with the iron vessels they were giving two very difficult things. One was gun that was meant to quarrel among the tribes, and the second was alcohol. And with this alcohol, they were badly addicted, and because of this addiction, their lives started to spoil. And that was something that Europeans wanted, because to expand their empire, to expand their settlements, that was something which would make the path very easy. So what happened over the course of time? People from Britain, people from Spain, Portugal, France, Holland started to move towards America. There was an interesting concept in Europe. In Europe, there was a concept that the younger sons would not inherit the land. So any land that is there would go to the older son, and as a result, what happened? All the younger children from Europe started to come to America. And when they started to come to America, they understood the concept. The native do not have much idea of the local things. So what to do is to buy the land from them at a very cheaper very cheaper cost, or a very cheap price, and they started to settle there. Now, people from Poland started to enter the prairies grassland area, and when they entered the prairies grassland area, they considered this as very similar to what was there in the steppes in Europe, but they thought that we should grow something different here which could be exported to Europe, and let's earn something out of it. So they started to cultivate two important things. One was rice, the other was cotton. Both rice and cotton was not growing in Europe. So they started to cultivate, the people from Poland started to cultivate rice and cotton in the prairies grassland of Americas, and started to export and sell those in the regions of Europe. But these people were not very much exposed to the jungles around, to the wild animals around, and therefore they started hunting. They badly hunted all the wolves, all the mountain lions that existed into the region, and the population was nearly vanished from this region. Across their grasslands, they created barbed wires. So big fencings and wires were created so that their area is protected and no wild animal can enter into their territory. But This devastated the means of livelihood for the natives because they used to survive on hunting. And based on that, they were having their livelihoods. Now, no more animals there in the region would badly affect their livelihood, badly affect the natives. So, slowly and gradually, what happened was these native people were thrown onto other areas where they were either thrown into a region where another tribe was there. So let's say you have one tribe here, another tribe here. This tribe was rooted and thrown to another area. Now here, both the tribes would keep on fighting for the existence. Some of the tribe would require something, other of the tribe would require something. They would keep on a constant clash that would be there. So they started with quarrels and they were already supplying the guns. So their work became much more easier. The next important thing that happened was they threw the people from where they existed to any other random places because they cleared those lands for their own settlement, for their own farms, for their own agriculture, own industries. So they just picked up the roots of the native people and threw them somewhere else, and the places that they put them up were called as reservations. Now these reservations were the places where the Native Americans were kept. What happened in North America and the south side of North America was a little different story. In the north of North America, so we'll first focus on north of North America. The north of North America and the region of Canada were very much similar to the climatic conditions of Europe. So people who were moving from Europe into this region were happy and established themselves in the prairies, in the grasslands for the activities of fishing, fur, and started to have their livelihood, clear up the farm areas. But the south of North America had a humid, hot climate. And since Europeans were not in a habit of this humid and a hot climate, they started to die in huge numbers. So what they thought was, to survive in this climate, we need someone else on our behalf who could work. So they started to bring lots and lots of slaves from Africa. Now, this was the point where there was north and south divide within America, within North America that started. So right now we are not talking about South America at all. We are focusing only on the region of North America. So within the North America, the southern region was the region where you had slaves that started to come from Africa, and they started to do all the kinds of manual labor for livelihood that was required into this region. They hunted the lot of bisons, and all of the bisons were removed from the region more or less in order to make the region secure and safe for the common people, for the Europeans in America. But during this process, there was a huge divide between the ideologies. The northern people believed that there was no plantation, so no need for slavery. However, the people in south of North America believed that slavery is must. We cannot survive without the people coming in from Africa. So there was a constant clash on ideology, whether they should have slavery or whether they should not have slavery. And over the years, finally, gradually, slavery was abolished. Slavery was removed from the setup. The separate trains for whites, for blacks were removed, and there was a kind of a common platform that was being provided to the whites and blacks. But the story was not here enough. In the region of Canada, again, you had autonomous states confederation that started, and that was where the French dwellers, so specifically in the regions of Quebec in Canada, you had French dwellers that started. People from France established themselves, and they started to demand an autonomy. Now again, it is an interesting story that most of the places where Europeans went in Americas, you have English as the official language, but in Canada, French is an official language because of the same reason. You had a lot of migration from France that started there. Europeans had a very different view about who is civilized. So they believed three important things to be civilized. They said a person must be literate, a person must have organized religion, and must have an urbanism or an urban lifestyle. Only and only then these people are considered to be civilized. Now, so according to this viewpoint, the native people of America were uncivilized people, so they should be taken and thrown into where? Into the reservation areas. What happened in Europe during this time was again interesting. Within the Europe, there was persecution of people belonging to different sect of Christianity. So let's say this is a region of Catholic majority. Now, in this region of Catholic majority, if you have a Protestant group that is there, they were persecuted. If this is a region of Protestant majority, the Catholics were persecuted. So from a region where Protestants were minority and where Catholics were minority, they started to move out. And they moved where? They started to move to the region of Americas to have and establish themselves. However, there were various concepts that were given. Europeans believed these natives were uncivilized people, but Jacques Rousseau said that these people need to be admired because the natives of the land, the indigenous people here, were free of corruption. There was no corruption because they did not had any feeling for owning the land. The people coming in from Europe were very greedy about fur, greedy about land, and no such thing existed in the native peoples. So Jacques Rousseau believed that that was a kind of noble savage that occurred during this time. Similarly, were the views of Wordsworth, Washington Irving, and many other people from Europe during that time. As we said, hundreds and thousands of animals were slaughtered, put to death, and the idea was there was a huge demand for meat. There was a huge market in Europe, and only to meet their market requirements, all the things were happening here. So the natives who were only growing for their needs, for their own purpose, were forced to grow, forced to hunt for profit, and they could for long not understand what was actually going around. Now, if we look onto this map, what we consider about the present day United States was not formed in one day. So the red region, as you could see, was the United States back in 1783. Slowly and gradually, you had a territory which was purchased from France. So this whole Louisiana was purchased from France. Then you had a region that was ceded from the Britain. You had annexation of the region of Texas that took place. So this was from France. Then you had Great Britain that merged again. The region of the Oregon County, you had the Gadsden province that merged. And finally, from Mexico, this region was ceded. From Russia, you had Alaska that was ceded to America, and the present day Americas, as we could see, is in map. So there was purchase from France, purchase from Russia, and a war from Mexico that took place, and the territories were finally brought into shape as of the present day United States of America that we could see. So if we look onto some of the timelines, we have the timelines for Canada and United States. Now, the sole idea to bring this timeline is how the things started. So as we said, there was the purchase that started from France for the Louisiana. Later on, the natives were moved to the reservation colonies. There was a gold rush in the region of California that we would understand in a while. And then with this gold rush, there was a demand for intercontinental connections. So transcontinental railway lines were built, bisons were removed, exterminated, killed in huge numbers, and finally you had the end of American frontier. And similarly, you had the gold rush that also started in the region of Canada, but this gold rush was around 10 years later than the American gold rush that was witnessed. Now, understanding the native people, how they lost their lands. So these native people, what happened over the course of time was the settlements started to expand. When these settlements were expanding, these people were forced to move out of their land, and they were forced to sign treaties and agreements, and finally they were forced to sell their land. So these native people had no other option but to sell their lands and move into either the regions of another tribe or into some reservation areas or the reservation stations that were granted for them. So that was the process that was adopted by Europeans during that time. And one very interesting case study that we would understand is of the Chiruk tribe. Now, Cherokee tribe is an interesting tribe from Georgia. Now, Cherokee tribe, people of this tribe are considered to be some of the most well literate people because they tried hard to learn English as well. And the Cherokee tribe was governed by the state laws, but they could not enjoy the right to citizenship. That was one of the main things that drew them forward. So what happened was, there was John Marshall, the US Chief Justice, who basically said that the Cherokees are distinct communities and they should be given they should have the right to citizenship. But during that time, the President of United States, Andrew Jackson, believed, despite of all the scenarios that were going in, he was against the concept of granting them the right to citizenship. As a result, he ordered the army to basically evict the land of Cherokees, and nearly 15,000 people were forced to move out of their native land, resulting into Trail of Tears, as it is called as. And this Trail of Tears led to nearly a quarter people dying in this event. So 1/4 of 15,000 people died when they were forced to move out of the region. And that was with the case of one of the best tribes that was considered, in the sense that they were very, very close to the American way of life, very, very close to knowing English and the developments that could be seen. And therefore, this story of Trail of Tears is very, very important in American history. Again, there were views from the people who were trying to conquer their land. They believe that these people are lazy, they do not work, they do not deserve any land, they do not have good skills to sell their products into market, they are not working hard as craftsmen, and they do not have a sense to dress properly, and therefore they are uncivilized people. They should be thrown away from this region. And therefore, their areas were removed. They were moved into reservation stations. Most of the areas where the bisons were hunted were killed on a huge area, and it was said that primitive man must disappear with these primitive animals. So the idea was to disappear the natives along with the animals that they used to hunt. And the natives were forced to move. They were not only forced to move from this example of Georgia that we are talking about, where we have the Cherokee tribe, but also from the area where you had gold, where you had oil resources that were seen, or where you had lead reserves that were seen. Either of the techniques were applied. Either they were sent to the reservation stations, or they were sent to the territory of another tribe, where they would have a constant conflict and quarrels that would occur. So that was the kind of idea that started. But during this time, there was another important thing that started, and this was gold rush. California, there was discovery of gold, and this magical discovery of gold led to numerous Europeans flowing into the region of Americas for this gold. You had Europeans who were hungry for this gold and were trying to make up their fortune. So they started to build up railway lines. To build up those railway lines, you required labor. They brought in lot of immigration from China as laborers to complete this task. And by 1870s in United States and by 1885 in Canada, the railway line projects were completed. Now again, the Industrial Revolution that started in England, basically we have studied that in a separate class, but the idea was the Industrial Revolution in London or in England, basically, what it did was the small peasants started to lose their land. Their land was sold to a big farmer, and those people started to move to urban areas for jobs into factories. But the story of industrial revolution in Americas is totally different. There were two things that prompted the industrial revolution. One was the railway equipments. The country being so large, distant communication was difficult, and they required railway tracks to be developed at a faster pace in order to communicate. And lot of construction started to go for railway equipments and railway line projects. The second important development was machines for farms. Since you had extensive farming that was done, that means huge parcels of land that were there, it was required that human beings cannot manually do it. Either they required some people who could work on the farms, or there could be big machines, tractors, threshers that could come in. So large machines were developed for farming equipments. So those were the two important bases on which the industrial revolution started in North America. Now this was important because the towns and the cities started to grow, started to multiply in the regions of Americas, and within couple of years, when if we say in 1860s, America was one of the undeveloped economies. In 1890s, it was one of the leading industrial powers of the world. So within a mere span of 30 years, there was so much development in the field of industrialization that was seen in America. The large scale agriculture expanded. You had huge extensive farming that started. The animals, as we said, bisons, were already exterminated, and the native people were thrown into the reservation areas, and within few years America started to colonize. So there were colonies in Hawaii, there was colonies in Philippines that developed, and slowly and gradually America was now turning into an imperial power. But during this time, there was another story that ran very parallel to it, and those was the independence and the constitutional rights. So according to the constitution, at that time, white men had the right for had the democratic right as well as the right to property. However, no such right was being bestowed to the native or the Native Americans of that region. Now, Louis Merriam, in his work The Problem of Indian Administration 1928, just before the Great Depression started to begin in 1930s, pointed out that this depression is going to badly affect and ruin the life of the Native Americans for health and education. And that was something that was witnessed during the Great Depression of 1930s in Americas. The life of the natives in the way of health, in the way of education, deteriorated to the worst of the possible scenarios. By 1950s and 60s, both the governments of United States and Canada were trying to bring in provisions for the native in a hope that they could be brought to the mainstream, but at the same time they were trying that these people should not mix up with the mainstream American people. So there was a kind of segregation that was constantly being maintained, and in 1954, under the Declaration of Indian Rights that was prepared by the native people, it was accepted that they would have the citizenship of America, but on a condition that the reservation areas that they had would not be taken away from them. The reservation areas would be the land for the native people now, and all their traditions would be maintained. No one has the right to interfere with their traditions, with the functions that they do, with the culture that they believe in. So with this, the Declaration of Indian Rights was signed in 1954. Now, as we said, in 1934, there was Indian Reorganization Act, and it gave the natives in the reservation area the right to buy the land, to take loans. So they were allowed to buy the land in their reservation colonies, And as we have seen in the beginning, they did not had any mental makeup for owning the land, for buying the land, but they were forced into that mentality over the span of years, as we have seen. So under the Indian Reorganization Act, they were allowed to buy the land, they were allowed to take loans to buy the land. Then, as we said, in 1960s and 70s, all the special provisions for the natives were ended. The sole idea was they should not get mixed up with the mainstream people, and the natives also did not wanted that, and the mainstream people also did not wanted that. In 1954, there was Declaration of Indian Rights, where they were given the citizenship for America. They were well believed that their lands would remain their lands in the reservation areas. It would not be acquired, and all their traditions would be considered as their own traditions. No one would interfere with their traditions. Later on, in 1969, there was another movement which said we are not to recognize the aboriginal rights of the individuals, and there was a kind of lot of opposition and politics going around. And in 1982, the Constitution Act accepted the treaty rights, and it said that the existing aboriginals, the existing native people, and the treaty rights for the native people must occur. So that was one of the major things that happened. The taxes which were arbitrary on the native people were slowly and gradually rationalized. They were brought onto an equal level. Initially, any amount of tax used to be charged to the native people, but later on this was rationalized, and there was a kind of system where they were brought into the mainstream. Even as of now, you have the reservation for the Red Indians or the Native Americans in the government jobs or the federal jobs in Americas. So that was about how the indigenous people of Americas struggled, and they were trying to have their own survival, and with all the hardships, how they have protected their rights as of now. So the changing scenario and the viewpoints by different scholars have been discussed.